Okay, hi everybody, thank you for coming, and I guess Hanukkah is over, but I hope Hanukkah was very enjoyable for everyone. And first, today's shir is dedicated for a Refua Shelema for Breya bat Chava and Chaim Aryeh ben Rivka. May they have a Refua Shelema b'toch shar cholei Yisrael. In addition, Yiboneh is conducting its annual end of the secular year fundraising campaign. They have many new projects that require funding, as well as their ongoing activities. The new projects include several new chesed projects with new olim and the elderly, as well as setting up a Beit Knesset is in the works. Anyone interested in knowing more about these projects should speak to Rabbi Poston directly, and a link to donate is found in the YouTube description box, as well as the Boneh website. And an additional aspect here is every donation is matched by a generous contributor until the end of the campaign, which means every dollar you give becomes $2 or whatever. Please help us reach our goal in the next few days. And finally, once again, tonight's class is sponsored by an anonymous donor. So Mr., Mrs., or Miss Anonymous, we thank you very much, and may your support of Torah be a zechus for you and your entire family. In Parshas Vayigash, we kind of come to the culmination of a story that's already been taken up with two Parshios, Vayeshev, Miketz, Vayigash, the story of Mechiras Yosef, which is the longest thematic narrative in Chumash Bereshis. And Mechiras Yosef, the whole story of Yosef, is one of the great perplexing stories of the Torah. It is so rich in so many ways that people analyze it religiously, they analyze it psychologically, they analyze it in terms of literary structures. There are so many different ways of approaching the immense richness of this topic. And you never really get to the bottom of it, meaning this is one of those things where, you talk about it this year and you'll talk about it next year and you'll be pondering and you're not going to come to any final resolution. But I do want to offer, one approach to this, and that is there are a lot of questions. First of all, people say, how could the brother sell Yosef? I always say, people always want to know, what's the proof that the Torah is written by God and it's not a man-made document? So I would say, at least half-jokingly, that if we would be the ones who are writing the Torah, there's a whole bunch of stuff we wouldn't put in. We wouldn't put in Yaakov stealing the blessings from Esav by deception. We wouldn't put in that the brothers of Yosef sold Yosef into slavery and in fact wanted to kill him. That doesn't reflect well upon us. To say that we wrote the Torah somehow when we put in all of this negative information would be self-contradictory. And therefore, only God could have written a book like this. What do they say? It's not a believable story. Only God could have given us all of these details. But still, let's just give a pashut pshat in each aspect of the problem. Problem one, how could the brothers who are considered to be righteous, and they are the founders of the Jewish nation, how could they sell their brother into slavery? I mean, that's something that even like the lowest of the low. In fact, it was so interesting, just as an aside. For some reason, this week I just saw an old 60 Minutes interview that goes back around 20 years with a mafia chieftain who had been a very vicious killer. He had killed like at least 50 people. And, Ed Bradley was asking him, does your conscience ever bother you? He says, no, this is a job. And I did my job. And he even said, it's so stupid, he says, I didn't know them, so why should I feel bad? I didn't know them at all. But then he started talking about the fact that now he's in prison and he doesn't get to see his wife and children and grandchildren. And he starts crying like he's such a great family guy. Meaning the concept would be that even this cold-blooded murderer, has a feeling for his family. So now I swing back to the story of Yosef's brothers. Look what they did to their brother. How could that be? So there's a famous comment of the Seforno. Rav Ovadia Seforno was one of the great commentators on the Chumash, and he lived in Italy during the Renaissance. In fact, part of his parnasa was he was both a physician and he was a Hebrew tutor to many prominent cardinals in the Catholic Church. That was his parnasa. He actually taught Gentiles, not so much Torah, because that raises halachic issues, but he did teach them Hebrew. And the Seporno offers the following interpretation. The brothers had seen a certain pattern in the relationship of father to child. They saw that Avraham had a son Yishmael from Hagar, and then he had a son Yitzchak from Rivka, and eventually Yishmael was expelled, and the covenant of Avraham was transmitted to Yitzchak and not to Yishmael. And then Yaakov has twins. Yitzchak has twins, Yaakov and Esav, and the same thing happens. Eventually, whatever the justification is, Yaakov takes that blessing, and Yaakov takes that covenant, and Esav moves to Mount Seir, which is south of Eretz Yisrael. There is this notion of good son, bad son. Good son gets the covenant. This is not a matter of material riches. This is a matter of spiritual destiny. The spiritual destiny goes to the good son. Bad son is excluded. So now they see that, number one, Yaakov does have multiple wives, but Rachel is his favorite wife. And Rachel only has two sons. She has Yosef, who is older, and Binyamin. And they see that Yosef is bringing Lashon Hara about his brothers to the father, that they're guilty of various sins, various averos. It's a whole discussion exactly what averos would they be guilty of. But they see this not simply as Yosef being a tattletale, but they see it as Yosef trying to put a wedge between themselves and Yaakov. And the probable impact of that is going to be that they will be labeled, so to speak, the bad seed, and the covenant of Yaakov will pass exclusively to the children of Rachel. Now that is not simply a slight, like giving up your inheritance. That affects the destiny of the rest of their lives and the lives of their progeny until the end of history. They see Yosef as engineering an exclusion from the future of the Jewish people. And therefore the Seporno quite logically says they looked at Yosef as a rodef. What's a rodef? If somebody is trying to kill me, I'm allowed to kill them. Haba lahargacha, somebody who's coming to kill you, you kill them if there's no other way to disable them. Now, they saw what Yosef was doing as far more detrimental than the loss of a physical life. They saw this as affecting their destiny in Olam Haba. They saw this as affecting the destiny of all of their children till the end of time. And Chazal already say, Gadol hamachtiyo yosem min hargo. He who causes me to sin and be separated from God is worse than a person who kills me physically. Because a person who kills me physically is only killing my guf, my body. One who takes me away from my role as a Jew is destroying my neshama. Therefore, they paskined that Yosef is a rodef. And as a rodef, they convened a beis din, so to speak. This is the Seporno. As a rodef, Yosef is chayav misa, is deserving of death. But if they could disable him by something less than death, such as selling him into slavery, that would be preferable. And thus, they actually felt that al pi din, according to the halacha, whatever the halacha meant before Matan Torah, they were permitted to do what they did. Now, if you find this convincing, you may then ask, well, so why are the brothers punished? Why are they condemned? It's very clear that the Torah regards the sale of Yosef as a major sin, but what was the sin? They were justified. The answer must be that even if intellectually they came to a certain justification, part of what drove them to that conclusion was their jealousy, was their envy. They were not in a position to be objective judges over that particular issue. And along with the righteous motivation of getting rid of a rodef came a certain satisfaction in dumping on a brother that they thought was arrogant and proud and looked down upon them. So it could very well be that there was a justification for what they did, but their motives were not 100% pure. In fact, the Orach Chaim HaKadosh, Rav Chaim ben Attar, was a gadol from Morocco who came to Eretz Yisrael. He was really contemporary of the Vilna Gaon, more or less, and he is buried in Har HaZeisim here in Yerushalayim. I think his yard site is right before, is it the 15th of Tammuz? It's right before Shiva Sarba Tammuz. I think maybe the 15th of Tammuz. And it actually attracts tens of thousands of people to this day, go to the Orach Chaim's kever on the Mount of Olives. But the Orach Chaim, we call him Orach Chaim HaKadosh. You see, it's a special distinction. Not too many commentaries are called the Holy One. Even Rashi, we typically don't say Rashi HaKadosh, but for reasons I'm not entirely sure, the Orach Chaim gets that appellation as Kadosh. And there's a fascinating Orach Chaim which deals with a very controversial philosophical point. If you remember, and again, I'm going back a little bit to Parshas Vayeshev, because all of these three Parshios are dealing with Mechiras Yosef, and we didn't have a chance to talk about it because we were talking about Chanukah. So I often will talk about Mechiras Yosef when we get to Parshas Vayigash after Chanukah. And if you remember, Reuven basically told the brothers, hey, let's not kill Yosef, let's throw him into the pit. And then the kavanah was that Reuven was planning on coming back later and retrieving Yosef, but while he was gone, unbeknownst to Reuven, they sold Yosef into slavery. Now the Gemara has a famous drasha, because the Torah describes the pit as the pit was empty, but it didn't have water. So the Gemara asks the obvious question, if it was empty, of course there was no water. What's the reason? Why do you have to state there was no water? So the Gemara has a drasha, there was no water, but there were snakes and scorpions. So the question is obvious. If the pit is filled with snakes and scorpions, and Reuven's intention is not to kill Yosef, but to throw him into a pit and retrieve him later, then what is Reuven thinking? If you throw somebody into a pit or snakes and scorpions, that person will be killed. In fact, the Mishnah says in Yevamos that if witnesses testify that a man fell into a pit of snakes and scorpions, even if they didn't see his dead body, his wife is permitted to remarry as a widow because it's a certainty that they killed him. So what's Reuven thinking? If Reuven wants to save Yosef, how could he possibly throw him into a pit of snakes and scorpions? Now, the simple answer would be, he didn't know. The Torah is telling me this was the case, but he didn't know. But the Orach Chaim says differently. The Orach Chaim says an amazing thing. Quite an amazing thing. He says, listen, the brothers paskin that Yosef deserves to die based on the Sepornos Cheshbon that Yosef is a Rodef. But Reuven brings up the following argument. Maybe our judgment is right. Maybe our judgment is wrong. After all, we have personal bias. We have a personal agenda. If we kill Yosef, that is not proof that God has accepted our judgment. Because even if God does not accept our judgment and Yosef is innocent, since we have free will, this is the Orach Chaim's Chiddush, we have the power to harm a person who is undeserving of harm in the eyes of God. So the fact that we kill him does not show that he's guilty, because we are Balei Bechira, and murderers can murder innocent people. We are people of free will. But, says the Orach Chaim, animals don't have free will. Animals can harm someone only if it's God's decree that they be harmed. Therefore, if we want to know if our judgment is correct or incorrect, we should not be the ones who kill Yosef. We'll throw him in the pit and see if the snakes kill him. If the snakes kill him, that's a proof our judgment is correct. If the snakes don't kill him, that's a proof that God has exonerated him. This, by the way, an idea similar to this is the source of the Christian notion that some charismatic sects have of playing with snakes. I don't know what they call it. They fool around with poisonous snakes because they basically say, if you believe in God, the snake is not going to hurt you. All I can tell people is, do not try this at home. But the Orach Chaim, both parts of the Orach Chaim are big chidushim. Part one is a chiddush as well. The Orach Chaim, because the Chava Salavavos, which was a sefer many hundreds of years before the Orach Chaim, makes a very famous point that no human being can harm another human being unless it is directly decreed by God. I cannot harm you unless God wanted you to be harmed. For whatever reason. We don't know, we know the reason. It's impossible for anyone to do anything to anybody unless it's God's decree. That's the Chavas Halavavas. The Orach Chaim is saying exactly the opposite. The Orach Chaim is saying, because God gave human beings free will, because God gave me the ability to decide to either sin or not sin, an inevitable fallout of my power of free will is that some people are going to be hurt. You see, this raises a fundamental question. I mean, let's take a very simple example. Let's say a person goes to a convenience store, a person goes to a 7-Eleven in the States, 3 o'clock in the morning, in a bad neighborhood. Not the wisest thing. And while he's there, a robber comes in with a gun. And the robber looks kind of nervous. A nervous robber is not good. It's good to have a calm robber, because nervous robbers are very trigger happy and the like. The person's nervous. And let's assume, well, one of two things can happen. Either he shoots somebody, kills them, or doesn't. Now, here's the problem. Does the robber have free will to pull the trigger or not pull the trigger? Meaning, does God make him pull the trigger? Absolutely not. It is fundamental in Judaism that the decision to be virtuous or sinful is up to the individual. The individual has a choice. This is called bechira. This is a rejection of predestination that exists under certain Islamic schools of thought and under certain Christian schools like Calvinism and the like. Judaism is free choice. So that means the robber could have decided at the last minute to do tshuva and throw away the gun and go to yeshiva or whatever it would be. But here's the thing. According to the Chavas Halavavos, how do you match it? Nobody dies unless God decrees that they would die. So, if the robber shoots, the guy dies. If the robber doesn't shoot, what's supposed to happen? Is the guy going to die? According to the Chavas Halavavos, the assumption has to be that he's going to get a heart attack anyway. Meaning to say, it's not the murderer that killed him. The murderer is accountable not for what he did. The murderer is accountable for the evil decision that he made. It's very, very interesting. The murderer didn't kill the victim, says the Chavas Halavavos. Hashem decreed that at that moment that victim should die. So what Hashem does is, it's like a chess player. Hashem uses the choice of the robber to carry out what God's decree is. If the robber were to make a different choice, it would be carried out in another way. The guy would get a heart attack. The building would collapse. This gets increasingly difficult when you start looking at mass calamities like the Holocaust. Because the Chavas Halavavos would be saying, Hitler didn't kill 6 million Jews. God decreed, for whatever reason, we don't know why, that 6 million Jews would die. Hitler happened to make a choice to do that, so Hitler gets enlisted in carrying out God's plan. Meaning, if Hitler would have decided to do tshuva in the middle or at the beginning of the Holocaust, 6 million people would have died somehow over this period of, 12 years? It's hard to figure out. But like the Orach Chaim, in a sense, it's an easier paradigm. Although some say it's a less religious paradigm. Like the Orach Chaim, God created a world of free will. Now, why did God create free will? Because free will is the only way that you maximize goodness. Goodness is good only when it's chosen. Goodness is not good when it's mechanical and automatic. So God had to create free will so that true virtue would be possible. But the problem is, once you create free will, you've created the capacity to go in the other direction. Evil is a necessary evil. If that's the case, the Orach Chaim says, by God giving humanity free will, He gave humanity the capacity to commit holocausts. And all sorts of people might die and be victimized that God did not want to die or be victimized. Right? So this is a major issue in Jewish philosophy. Can Reuven harm Shimon if it's not God's decree that Shimon be harmed? The standard teaching that we teach in yeshivos is the Chovos HaLevavos, seminaries, that everything is decreed by God. That's the standard understanding. But one has to remember that the Orach Chaim says exactly the opposite. And in many, many ways, therefore, that would change the question that people ask about the Holocaust. People ask about the Holocaust, where was God? Why did God do this? According to the Orach Chaim, the question is not about God, although you can still ask why didn't God stop it, that's another question. But really the Holocaust says much more about the depravity of man than it says about God. Essentially, God let free will operate in the world, and when free will runs amok, you get Holocaust. Now, I'm not suggesting this is an answer, because again, there are still questions. Why doesn't God rein in these forces when they become excessively destructive? I mean, those are questions. They certainly are questions. But what I'm saying is, God himself is not the agent of the Holocaust. It is the decisions of human beings, in which God lets human beings have free reign, because in a cosmic sense, in a universal sense that goes way beyond the period between 1939 and 1945. Free will is a moral necessity for the attainment of virtue. And if free will is a moral necessity, there are going to be fallouts that are tremendously destructive. That's how the Orach Chaim, I think, would analyze this particular issue. But the second part of the Orach Chaim is equally amazing, and that is, an animal won't harm you unless God decreed that you be harmed, which is pretty amazing. As they say, one should never assume they're so righteous they can play with snakes and they're not going to hurt them. But the Orach Chaim says, the snake is not going to hurt you if you're not deserving of punishment. Now, the Gemara does have a story by Rabbi Chanina ben Daisa that a snake bit him and the snake died instead of him. So there are occasional stories that indicate that the tzaddik is more powerful than the snake. But b'derech klal, if you're bit by a snake, the consequences might be very, very serious. So that's how the Orach Chaim understands the story with Reuven. Okay. What's further amazing is that they didn't listen to Reuven's own test. Yosef was thrown into a pit of snakes and scorpions. Yosef emerged okay, and they still sold him. What's going on? They saw a miracle. I think that proves the point that when your objectivity is tainted with personal animosity, even obvious points are not going to be taken into account. They should have seen that Yosef was saved by a supernatural miracle, which he was, and it still didn't make a difference. So how accurate is it to say, oh, we're just carrying out our objective judgment? Okay, so whether you consider this a partial explanation or not, I'll leave it to you. You may not be satisfied with it, but this is one approach that is offered to the sale of Yosef. Now, as I say, it's very, very clear that this is regarded as an extremely serious aveira and blemish on the Jewish people. And in fact, we read in later Midrashim that the death of the 10 great martyrs that we read about on Yom Kippur and on Tisha B'Av was an atonement or a punishment for the sale that the 10 brothers did in selling Yosef. So it remains with us throughout this time. In fact, according to some sources, just like, every fast over the temple is rooted in an earlier tragedy. So the 9th of Av, the destruction of the temple, is rooted in the sin of the spies. The 17th of Tammuz, when the Romans broke the walls of Jerusalem, 3 weeks before the destruction of the temple, is rooted in the sin of the golden calf, when Moshe broke the luchos. But this next Tuesday, we have the fast of the 10th of Teves, which is the earliest chronologically of these fasts. That is when Nebuchadnezzar, the king of Babylon, began the siege against Jerusalem. So we're already thinking about the Beit HaMikdash. But what earlier event is Asara B'Teves rooted in? Shivas B'Tammuz is rooted in the Egel. Tisha B'Av is rooted in the Meraglim. What is Asara B'Teves rooted in? So I saw Rav Shlomo Fisher, Zechrono Livracha, suggests that it is rooted in Mechiras Yosef. He actually asserts, although he doesn't bring much of a proof. It's interesting. He just has a speculation. I didn't see any mucker that he brought, that maybe Asara B'Teves was the date that Yosef was sold. And that became a date of tragedy because of Mechiras Yosef. So this is the trilogy of primeval sins that caused all of the Galus and the Chorban. Mechiras Yosef, which is a Bein Adam Lechavero, hatred between people. And then we have the Chedo Egel, which is a form of idolatry and not serving God. And then we have which is Shivas B'Tammuz. And then we have rejecting Eretz Yisrael, which is the Chet of the Meraglim, which is the root of Tisha B'Av. Right? So we have people, the people of Israel, right? Peoplehood, God, and Eretz Yisrael. What's the motto? Isn't that the motto of Mizrach? I'm trying to remember. Eretz Yisrael, La'am Yisrael, Al-Pi Torah Yisrael. Right? So the three things. That Eretz Yisrael, Jewish nation, the Torah of Israel, which is your relationship to God. Okay. But now, let's look at the other side of the equation. So we've looked at the brothers. But now let's look at Yosef's behavior. Yosef's behavior in many, many ways, well, it depends. On one hand, maybe you can understand it because he has the right to be angry. He has the right to be upset. Yosef was victimized in a tremendous way. Yosef was betrayed. So from a humanistic standpoint, maybe Yosef's behavior is not so difficult. It's the way many of us would have acted. But many are not satisfied with that explanation because after all, Yosef too is supposed to be righteous, a tzaddik. How could it be that Yosef would be so cruel? Number one, he doesn't reveal himself. Well, for number one, he's gone for 22 years. Question number one is, why doesn't he ever send a message to his father? Why doesn't he send a message, I'm alive? Now, maybe when he was in Potiphar's house as an Eved, he didn't have access to email or would be, and certainly in prison, he didn't have those services. Right, the prisons in Egypt were not like the federal prisons today of color TV, and all cable TV and all that stuff. But certainly, once he's the Mishnah Lamelech, once he's in a position of supreme authority, couldn't he just notify his father? Why didn't he notify his father? That's one set of questions. And then, when the brothers come to him, and he doesn't identify, and they say, well, we have a younger brother at home, and this is the only surviving son, they think, of his favorite wife, Rachel, and it would break his heart if he would come down because something might happen to him. And Yosef says, bring him down without revealing himself, knowing what that's going to do to Yaakov. And then Yosef frames Binyamin as if to say Binyamin will be either put to death or enslaved. What is Yosef doing? And it seems to be from the narrative that Yosef would have kept on going had he not broken down at some point. When Yehuda comes forward and begs and argues and threatens and cajoles, he uses all the devices. He's obsequious, he's submissive, he's threatening. And Yosef just breaks down. But the implication is that Yosef would have continued something had he not broken down in that moment. So what's going on? So there are two basic approaches in the Meforshim. Approach number one is the approach of the Ramban. Rashi doesn't really give you a thematic approach here, but Ramban does. And Ramban says that Yosef feels it is a divine imperative to carry out the fulfillment of his dreams. When he was 17 years old, he had two dreams. That was the source of the brothers' jealousy. He had a dream of 10 sheaves of grain bowing down to his sheaf of grain, indicating that all of the brothers would acknowledge him as king, or 11 sheaves of grain. That was dream number one. And dream number two, the sun and the moon and 11 stars are bowing down to him. The sun is his father. The moon would be his mother, but of course Rachel is not alive, but Bilhah is the maidservant of Rachel who took over the raising him. So Yosef has a dream that he regarded as a divine prophecy, that he would be the king, he would be the ruler, not only over his 11 brothers, but even over Yaakov and Bilhah. This dream has to be fulfilled. He looks at it as a divine mandate. So when the 10 brothers come, he doesn't reveal his identity. They bow down and they beg for food. Well, that's a large fulfillment of the dream, but that's not everything. I have to get Binyamin down. And I can't tell him I'm his brother, because then Binyamin will look at me as a brother. He has to look at me as a king, or, Mishnah Lamelech. So therefore, step one was, bring Binyamin down without revealing my identity, so he will acknowledge me as a king. But there's still somebody missing. Yaakov has to come down. So what the Ramban says is quite amazing. Yosef's intention in framing Binyamin was to get Yaakov down, and Yaakov would beg and bow down and plead, and that would have been the conclusion of the dreams, and Yosef would have revealed himself at that point. What happened was that Yosef couldn't carry out his plan. Yehuda interrupted it. Yehuda's speech had such an emotional impact on Yosef that he broke down. And therefore Yaakov never came down to Egypt to beg for Binyamin's life. Although we do read that when Yosef visited Yaakov towards the end of Yaakov's life, it mentions Yaakov bowed down. So there was a fulfillment at the end, but not at this particular juncture. So this is the famous Shita of the Ramban, that all of Yosef's behaviors were to orchestrate the fulfillment of his chalomot. The Abarbanel, the great commentary of Yitzchak Breitowitz, was his lesser important job was he was finance minister of Spain, of Ferdinand and Isabella, at the time of the Spanish expulsion, and he left. He left all of that to be with the Jews. He was given permission to stay. He could have stayed. And he was even given authorization to be a practicing Jew because they needed his financial acumen, but he refused. But he wrote great commentaries on the Torah and on Nevi'im and on the book of Daniel in particular. He didn't write on the other Kesuvim, but the book of Daniel and the like. But the Abarbanel asks a kasha on the Ramban and says, isn't there an ends not justifying the means type of problem here? I have a dream that I'm supposed to be a king. So let's assume that's a prophecy. It's not a hallucination. But it's up to God to do that. I'm allowed to lie and cheat and hurt people because I have this dream. I have a dream that I'm supposed to be a king over you, therefore I'm going to hurt you, put you in prison. I have a dream that my father is supposed to bow down to me, therefore I am going to give my father the awesome pain of thinking that Binyamin is going to be taken. Meaning, a dream, even if it's prophetic, is not a commandment. It is simply telling you what is going to be. Hashem didn't tell Yosef, you are commanded to make yourself a king. Hashem is telling Yosef, you will be a king. Okay. How and when that's going to happen is up to Hashem. You certainly cannot do bad, painful, hurtful things to fulfill the dream that you regard as a prophecy. Right? So this is the Abarbanel's question on the Ramban. So because of this, the Abarbanel understands things in a different light. He understands that Yosef wants to be sure that his brothers have done tshuva for what they've done. The genesis of Mechiras Yosef, even if at the end of the day they had some type of halachic justification, but the Torah says the genesis of Mechiras Yosef was hatred that was born of jealousy. And the jealousy started because Yaakov, and the Gemara actually criticizes Yaakov for this, interestingly enough. Yaakov played favorites. Not supposed to play favorites with your children. Yaakov loved, or at least behaviorally loved, the children of Rachel more than Leah, because he loved Rachel more than Leah. Not only that, but there may have been an undercurrent of resentment against Leah, because Leah was part of a deception that prevented him from marrying Rachel right away. Although they only were married a week apart, but still, he wanted Rachel to be his first wife. So, the genesis of Mechiras Yosef is the jealousy that the Bnei Leah and the other tribes have for Bnei Rachel. Yosef wants to be sure that they have overcome that jealousy. So he wants to bring Binyamin down. He wants Binyamin to be framed, potentially arrested, to look as if he is in jeopardy. And then, if the brothers have overcome their jealousy, they will fight for Binyamin. If they still have that jealousy, they're going to say to their father, well, sorry, Dad, what could we do? Binyamin was taken. In other words, they're not going to be so unhappy that Binyamin, who took over the role of favorite son after Yosef was sold, would be imprisoned or enslaved or whatever. So Yosef is trying to see, have the brothers done tshuva by overcoming their jealousy and hatred? Yehuda is the head brother, so to speak, of Leah's side. In fact, from Yehuda will come Malchus, will come royalty, will come Mashiach. When Binyamin is threatened, Yehuda basically comes forward. Yehuda is willing to give his life so that Yaakov will be reunited with Binyamin. And when Yosef sees that the brothers have transcended their hatred, their jealousy, their animosity, now Yosef is ready to reveal himself to his brothers because they have overcome the jealousy that caused the sale. And that is why Yosef is willing to forgive his brothers, because they have done tshuva. This is how the Abarbanel learns. But I have a little observation on the Abarbanel. That is, could we not ask on the Abarbanel the same question the Abarbanel asked on the Ramban? And that is it Yosef's business to orchestrate tshuva in a way that's going to cause so much pain and suffering and agony on the part of his father Yaakov, that Binyamin is taken and Binyamin is framed, and the like? Once again, if somebody did an Aveira, they have to do tshuva. Am I allowed to lie to them, to cheat them, to hurt them, to goad them to do tshuva? Once again, that's their responsibility. Why is it Yosef's responsibility to be sure that his brothers do tshuva, and that justifies the lying and the deception and the pain he's causing Yaakov? So here, I think you need to supplement the Abarbanel with one additional observation. Yosef, to put it mildly, has an extraordinary life. Yosef's life wouldn't even be a believable motion picture. A person who grows up in the house of Yaakov Avinu, who is sold into slavery by his own brothers, who comes to Egypt and starts off as a slave, and then rises within the household, and is then framed by a false claim of adultery, is imprisoned for 10 years, actually 12 years altogether, but because of his ability to interpret dreams, rises to be the most powerful person in Egypt, other than Paro, and really the most powerful person in the world, because the famine was a worldwide, at least Middle East, or at least a worldwide Middle East phenomenon, if not totally worldwide. I don't know if there was a famine in America then, or who was living in America then. So Yosef has an extraordinary life. But Yosef looks at his life and says, why? Why are these things happening to me? Why did my life turn out the way it turned out? I start from the nadir, from the rock bottom of what life is, to be a slave in Egypt, to be a prisoner languishing in a cell, to becoming what I am now. God must have a mission for me. There must be a purpose in this. It doesn't make sense. Now the truth is, every one of us has a purpose. But it doesn't hit us so much because, for most of us, life is not necessarily so extraordinary. But when your life is extraordinary, it's hitting you in the face that there got to be some meaning to this. And the meaning that Yosef himself came to is, God decreed to Avram that at some point in time, didn't say when exactly, his children are going to be enslaved in Egypt. And they will be persecuted. And they'll be gullus. And the truth is, all of the exiles are rooted in the exile of Egypt. That's the prototype for Babylonia, for Persia, for Greece, for Rome, for Yishmael. It's all rooted in Mitzrayim. So Yosef defines his mission. My mission is to be the advance party to teach my brethren how to survive Galus and remain faithful to Hashem. That's why I'm here. They used to have this expression, the canary in the coal mine, right? If you wanted to know if there were leakages of gas, you put a canary there. So Yosef is the canary. Yosef is the advance party. Now, therefore, Yosef has to go through all of the experiences of Galus and show us how to navigate them. He experiences slavery, because we will experience slavery. He experiences imprisonment and persecution, because we will experience that. He experiences wealth and power and affluence, which can also take a person away from God, even more so. We experience that. Yosef has to go through every experience that we will go through in our Golus. So we learn from him how to be faithful, how to be strong, how to be committed, not to give up no matter what your circumstance is, not to be destroyed by poverty and affliction and persecution, and not to be destroyed by affluence and success. That can also destroy you, maybe even more so. So Yosef understands that that's his mission. His mission is to prepare the Jewish people to survive Mitzrayim, but to survive all the Goliaths till the end of time. Now we know that the Jewish people, we're going to see this in the book of Shmos, the Jewish people spent 210 years in Mitzrayim. They should have been there 400 years. God took them out 190 years early. Why is that so? Because there is a tradition that after 210 years we had reached the 49th level of impurity. And if you hit level 50, you're irredeemable. And God had to take us out. If we would have hit the 50th level, that's the end. And ad kedei kach, that's the meaning. We didn't have time to let our dough rise. The few minutes it would have taken for the bread to become chametz, we would have hit the 50th level. I don't even know what that means. And as it were, 4/5 of the Jews died because they did hit the 50th level. So when we say they're on the 49th level, that's the 1/5 that we're taking. But notwithstanding that, the Gemara says the Jews had some merits that enabled them to survive. It mentions they didn't change their name. They kept their Jewish names. They didn't change their language. They spoke the Hebrew language, Lashon HaKodesh. There are different lists. Some say they wore distinctively Jewish clothing. Others say they didn't speak Lashon Hara against each other. Now, here's the thing to consider. They kept their Hebrew names. They kept their Jewish language. They didn't intermarry. They wore distinctive Jewish clothing. Was this because they were from? Is this because they were religious? Clearly not, because look at what they didn't do. They didn't practice bris milah, except for the tribe of Levi, and they worshipped avodah zarah, except for the tribe of Levi. So they weren't from, they worshipped avodah zarah. So you might ask the question, what's the value of having a Hebrew name? Right? It's like, you meet a guy in Tel Aviv, Rafi. Okay? And Rafi wears a Magen David, but he doesn't believe in God, and he doesn't keep Shabbos, and he doesn't keep kosher. But he says, hey, I'm a good Jew because my name is Rafi, and I wear a Magen David. We might laugh at that. But the funny thing is, apparently, it's not such a laughable proposition. Because the concept is, if you identify with Jewish peoplehood, that counts for quite a lot. Even if you're not yet keeping the Torah or keeping the mitzvahs. I've mentioned this before, forgive me for repeating it. When I lived in Chicago many years ago, there was a restaurant on Devon Avenue. I think it's still there. It's called The Bagel. And The Bagel was a treif restaurant. It was not kosher, but it was kosher style restaurant. So I remember walking by, this was probably 1977 or 78, and there was a sign on the window on Shabbos that says, we give a free glass of wine for every order of cholent on Saturday. So I was thinking to myself, I was more cynical in those days, oh, that's really great. Some guy remembers having cholent from his grandmother on Shabbos, so he goes into The Bagel, he orders non-kosher cholent with non-kosher wine and pays money on Shabbos and eats and thinks he's having a Shabbos experience. That's gastronomic Judaism, so to speak. It doesn't mean anything. Worthless, superficial. It's everything that's wrong about American Jewish identification that's not connected to Torah. Right? Okay. That's one way of looking at it. It's largely a true way of looking at it. But it's not the whole story. Because you have this guy, he sees cholent, or he sees an advertisement for cholent, wine. He remembers that his grandfather did something on Shabbos. And he wants to connect to that. He doesn't know Torah, he doesn't know mitzvahs, he doesn't know anything. He never learned anything. But the fact that he wants to affirm himself as being Jewish, that counts for something. That is exactly what it means. They kept their names. They kept their language. They kept their clothing. These were not frumkeit things. These were what you might call pejoratively ethnic identifications. I'm sure you've had this experience sometimes where you're in an airport, like a Kennedy airport, and if you're wearing a kippah or tzitzis, or a woman is dressed sneas, so people come out of the woodwork and they say, I'm Jewish too. And I have to admit, that usually irritates me because I'm usually doing something, but I feel bad that it shouldn't irritate me. Somebody is saying, you're my people. I'm with you. I'm with you. So, ethnic identification is not as worthless as we sometimes assume it is. It's the beginning of redemption. Jewish peoplehood is not the end idea of being Jewish. The end idea is submission to God and acceptance of His commandments. But it is the foundational beginning. So now, let's go back to Yosef. Yosef understands that when his brothers come to him, this is the beginning of the galus. The galus is going to begin. And Yosef understands that this galus in Mitzrayim is going to be bitter. That this galus in Mitzrayim is going to take us down to the 49th level of Tumah and maybe the 50th, and we're not going to survive. But since it's Yosef's mission in life to give us the survival tools, Yosef cannot allow the galus to begin until he's sure that we have the foundation that will let us survive. And if the foundation is Jewish peoplehood, not changing the language, not changing the names, right, which is Jewish peoplehood, then he has to be sure that the brothers are one nation, that you no longer have hatred, you no longer have polarization, you no longer have divisiveness. He has to be sure that the brothers did tshuva, because the refuah, the cure, must be there before the makkah, before the illness begins. So I'm really augmenting the Barbanel, meaning if this would have been an issue of a private tshuva, hey, somebody hurt me, I wouldn't be allowed to put them through the ringer to be sure they do tshuva. It's really none of my business. They have an obligation to do tshuva. It's not my obligation to make sure they do tshuva. But this is very different. This is not a question of 10 guys did something bad to one guy. This is a question of, this is going to be the beginning of a galus that may destroy us. We have to be sure that the thing that will save us is already here before the galus begins. And that's Achdus and Avas Yisrael, as we see from not changing your language, not changing your name, etc. Therefore, Yosef has to determine that there is no jealousy, there is no hatred, there is no animosity. Each brother is willing to give his life for the other brother. The children of Leah are willing to sacrifice for the children of Rachel and the like. Now, it's interesting that normally Parshas Vayigash is read right after Chanukah, and typically it's read before the fast of Asara B'Teves. Now, first of all, I mentioned Rav Shlomo Fisher, who actually posits that Asara B'Teves may have been the day of Mechiras Yosef itself. But whatever it is, we think about the Beis HaMikdash, and when we think about the Beis HaMikdash, we think about the sins that caused the destruction of the Beis HaMikdash. Now, everyone knows the first temple was destroyed by the Babylonians because of the cardinal sins of idolatry and sexual immorality and murder, right, that we know. But the second Beis HaMikdash was destroyed because of sinas chinam, the irrational, groundless hatred that exists between Jews. And the Gemara in Yuma says, Bo Re'eh, come and see how bad sinat chinam is. The first temple that was destroyed for the worst of Eros, of Avodah Zarah, Gili Araya, Shvichas Damim, How long did that exile last? Only 70 years. 70 years. The second temple was built 70 years after the destruction of the first temple. But for Sinas Chinam, I mean, the Gemara was written more than 1,000 years ago, and even then the Golot had been so long, and then we would just add 1,300 more years to that. That's Sinat Chinam. And, unfortunately, Sinat Chinam is very much prevalent among the Jewish people today. Not just religious secular, but within all sorts of religious gradations. And when we fast on the 10th of Teves, all of us have to think about, what can we do? What can I do to enable a rebuilding of the Beis HaMikdash, which is really symbolic of Hashem's divine presence in the world. And the best thing we could possibly do would be each person in his own way, in his own level, tries to take away some of the Sinat Chinam that exists in Klal Yisrael. So, Be'ezras Hashem, hopefully the fast of Asar B'Teves may still be canceled, because the Beis HaMikdash, Mashiach may come before then. But if Chas v'Shalom, we do have to fast, may it be the last fast that we have to have. So, that's it. Thank you.
Yipa,